Arizona Territory, July of 1881. The sun had been up for 3 hours, and the ground was already too hot to touch with bare hands. A cavalry supply rider named Sergeant Thomas Eddings was making his weekly run from Fort Huachuca to a cluster of low buildings that sat in the scrub desert about a mile south of the post. The buildings had no official name. They appeared on no military map, no sign hung above the door, but every soldier stationed within 50 miles knew exactly what this place was and exactly what happened inside it. They called it the Hog Ranch. Eddings had been here before, dozens of times. He delivered whiskey, flour, lamp oil, the supplies that kept the place running. He had never asked questions about what he saw during those deliveries, because asking questions about the Hog Ranch was something soldiers at Fort Huachuca understood you did not do. The officers knew the place existed. The post surgeon visited monthly to examine the women inside for disease. The arrangement was understood by everyone and spoken of by no one. But on this particular morning, Eddings heard something that stopped him before he reached the front door. A sound coming from behind the building, faint, rhythmic. A scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. Slow and weak, the way an animal moves when it has been trapped for so long that it no longer has the energy to panic, but has not yet given up entirely. He followed the sound around the corner of the building to a patch of bare dirt against the back wall where the morning sun hit directly and without mercy. There was a wooden box on the ground. It was roughly 4 feet long, maybe 3 feet high. Built from unfinished pine planks nailed together crudely, the kind of construction a man could finish in an hour with scrap lumber and a handful of nails. The lid was fastened shut. There were no air holes that Eddings could see. The wood was hot enough to blister skin. The temperature in the open air was already climbing past 100 degrees. Inside a sealed wooden box sitting in direct desert sunlight, the heat would have been unbearable. 130 degrees, 140, the kind of heat that cooks meat. The scratching was coming from inside. Eddings pried a plank loose with the iron bar he carried for opening supply crates. The smell hit him first. Urine and sweat and something else, something sharper. The smell of a body consuming itself from the inside when it has been denied water long enough that its organs begin to fail. Then he saw her. A woman, curled on her side with her knees drawn up to her chest because the box was not large enough to allow any other position. Her dress was soaked through with sweat that had nowhere to evaporate in the sealed space. Her lips were cracked so badly they had split open and bled and dried and split again. Her eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated despite the sudden flood of light. The way eyes look when the brain behind them has begun to shut down from heat and dehydration. She had been inside that box for 2 days. Her name does not survive in the record. What survives is the reason she was put there. 3 nights earlier, she had tried to leave the Hog Ranch. She had waited until the owner was asleep, walked out the back door, and started moving north toward the fort, toward the only collection of people within walking distance who might help her. She made it less than half a mile before the owner caught her, dragged her back, and nailed her inside the box as punishment. Not for stealing, not for violence, for trying to leave. For attempting to walk away from a building she had never agreed to enter in the first place. What Sergeant Eddings had stumbled onto that morning was not an isolated act of cruelty by a single deranged man in the desert. It was a system, a punishment system that operated across dozens of establishments stretched along the entire western military frontier, from the Texas Panhandle to the Montana Territory, from the plains of Kansas to the deserts of New Mexico. A system that existed in the shadow of United States military forts, known to officers, tolerated by commanders, supplied by soldiers, and invisible to history for over 100 years, until now. You have seen the Old West in films. You know the version, swinging saloon doors and piano music. Women in feathered dresses leaning over balcony railings with painted smiles, choosing their clients the way a shopkeeper chooses which customer to serve next. A world where everyone out west was free, where the frontier meant opportunity, where even the most disreputable professions carried a kind of romantic independence. That version is a lie. It was constructed by an entertainment industry that needed the American frontier to feel adventurous rather than horrifying, and it has been repeated so many times that most people have never questioned it. The reality of the western frontier was something else entirely. Beyond the cattle towns and mining camps that at least had sheriffs and newspapers and some fragile thread of legal order, there existed a shadow world built around military outposts in territory, so remote that federal law was a concept rather than a practice. In that shadow world, a system of forced labor, debt imprisonment, and physical punishment operated openly for nearly 4 decades. The women trapped inside it had no legal standing, no access to law enforcement, no realistic means of escape, and no one who would listen if they managed to speak. When the United States Army finally investigated some of these establishments toward the end of the century, officers who had survived combat against the Comanche and the Apache wrote in their reports that the conditions inside were among the worst things they had ever witnessed. Men who had seen battlefields said the hog ranches were worse. If you want to understand how a system this brutal could operate within sight of the American flag, within walking distance of United States soldiers, for decades without consequence, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what I am about to reveal was deliberately buried, not by ancient history, not by a foreign civilization, by America, by your own country less than 150 years ago. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you stay until the end, because the connection between these frontier establishments and the United States military is something no school curriculum has ever dared to teach. To understand how the hog ranches came to exist, you need to understand what the Western military frontier actually was. Not the frontier of wagon trains and gold rushes, the other frontier. The one that existed after the Civil War ended in 1865, and the federal government turned its attention westward, with an army that suddenly had 250,000 soldiers and no war to fight. The solution was expansion, the Indian Wars, the systematic military occupation of territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast, and that occupation required forts. Between 1865 and 1890, the United States Army built or maintained over 200 military installations across the Western territories. Some were substantial posts with stone buildings and permanent garrisons. Most were not. Most were collections of wooden structures and canvas tents planted in landscapes so hostile that the Army's own records describe them with language closer to complaint than documentation. Fort Huachuca in southeastern Arizona, Fort Griffin in central Texas, Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory, Fort Robinson in Nebraska. Names that meant isolation on a scale that modern Americans cannot easily imagine. These forts were deliberately placed far from existing settlements. Their purpose was to project military power into territory that the government intended to take from its indigenous inhabitants, and that purpose required positioning soldiers at the edges of the known world rather than at its center. A posting to a Western fort in the 1870s meant living 50, 80, sometimes over 100 miles from the nearest civilian town. No railroad, no telegraph in many cases, no entertainment, no leave policy that would allow a soldier to visit civilization more than once or twice a year. The Army provided rations, weapons, shelter, a uniform, and $13 a month in pay. It provided nothing else. The men stationed at these forts were not the romantic cavalry officers of popular imagination. Most were recent immigrants who had enlisted because the Army offered meals and a bed to men who had neither. Many spoke limited English. Many were former Union or Confederate soldiers who had found no place in post-war civilian society. They were young, poorly educated, underpaid, and profoundly bored. Boredom on the frontier was not a minor inconvenience. It was a crisis. Military records from the period document epidemic rates of desertion, alcoholism, insubordination, and violence at isolated posts. Commanders struggled constantly to maintain order among men who had nothing to do between patrols except drink, fight, and wait. Into this vacuum came the entrepreneurs, civilians who recognized that several hundred men with regular pay and absolutely no way to spend it represented a market. They set up establishments just outside the boundary of military jurisdiction, typically 1 to 3 miles from the fort gates, on land the army did not technically control. Close enough that a soldier could walk there and back in an evening. Far enough that the commanding officer could claim, if pressed, that whatever happened at those establishments was a civilian matter beyond his authority. The placement was not accidental. It was calculated with the precision of a business plan, because that is exactly what it was. These establishments were the hog ranches. The name itself carried the dehumanization baked into the system. Its origin is debated. Some historians believe it derived from the livestock pens that some operators kept as a front business, a thin pretense of legitimacy. Others believe the name referred to the women inside, a term of contempt so casual that the men who used it did not register it as cruelty. Both explanations are probably true simultaneously. The hog ranch was a place where the line between livestock and human beings had been deliberately erased, and the name reflected that erasure with the bluntness that characterized everything about the frontier. From the outside, a hog ranch looked like nothing, a low structure built from whatever material was cheapest and closest. In the desert territories, adobe walls and dirt floors. On the plains, rough-cut timber with gaps between the planks wide enough to let wind and dust pass through freely. Some were partially underground, dugouts carved into hillsides with roofs of sod and timber, barely high enough for a man to stand. They were not built to attract customers through ambiance or appeal. They did not need to be. Their only competition was the empty desert, and the desert offered nothing. Inside, the layout followed a pattern consistent enough across hundreds of miles and dozens of establishments that it clearly represented a shared business model rather than individual invention. The front room served as a bar. Whiskey, rotgut mostly, sometimes cut with tobacco juice or turpentine to stretch the supply. Card tables if the owner could afford them. A counter where soldiers paid for drinks and for access to the back of the building. The prices were set to extract maximum cash from men earning $13 a month. A glass of whiskey cost between 10 and 25 cents. Access to the back rooms cost between 25 cents and $2 depending on the territory and the establishment. The back of the building was divided into cribs. The word itself tells you what you need to know. These were not rooms, they were enclosures. Each crib measured roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. Some were smaller. A bed frame, usually iron, bolted to the floor or to the wall. A wash basin, a thin curtain, or a plank door separating the crib from a narrow hallway. No windows in most cases. No ventilation beyond whatever air seeped through gaps in the construction. In summer, the temperature inside a crib in the Arizona or New Mexico territory could exceed 110 degrees. In winter on the northern plains, the same cribs dropped below freezing. The women who lived in these spaces occupied them around the clock. They ate there. They slept there. They worked there. Many rarely saw the outside of their crib from one week to the next. The economics of the system were designed with a precision that would have impressed any factory owner of the industrial age. A woman arriving at a hog ranch was immediately placed into debt. The owner charged her for the cost of her transportation to the territory. He charged her for the clothes she wore. He charged her for the food she ate, at prices he set and she could not negotiate. He charged her for the whiskey or laudanum he provided, sometimes forcibly, to keep her compliant. He charged her rent for the crib she occupied. Every dollar a soldier paid went to the owner first. Whatever remained after the woman's debts were deducted was theoretically hers. In practice, nothing ever remained. The debt was designed to be mathematically impossible to repay. Each month's charges exceeded each month's earnings by a margin calculated to keep the woman permanently indebted, and therefore permanently trapped. This was not a new mechanism. Debt bondage was the engine that drove labor camps, mining towns, and company stores across the American frontier. What made the hog ranch version uniquely devastating was that the labor being extracted was not muscle or skill, but the women's bodies themselves, hour after hour, client after client, in a 6-by-8-foot room in the desert with no possibility of refusal and no end date to the debt that justified their captivity. A miner in a company town could at least imagine the seam running dry and the camp closing. A woman in a hog ranch crib had no equivalent horizon. The soldiers kept coming, the debt kept growing, and the box behind the building waited for anyone who tried to make it stop. The women who ended up inside those cribs did not arrive by accident. They were brought there through networks of deception, coercion, and outright purchase that stretched from the port cities of the eastern seaboard to the most remote corners of the western territories. Understanding who these women were and how they got there is essential to understanding why escape was nearly impossible and why punishment was the system's primary tool of maintenance. Some were recruited through newspaper advertisements. This was the most common method in the 1870s and 80s, when Western expansion created a legitimate demand for female labor in hotels, laundries, and domestic households. Advertisements placed in newspapers in cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco offered young women transportation west and guaranteed employment at wages that would have been exceptional for the era. A woman working 12-hour days in a textile mill in Massachusetts earned perhaps $3 or $4 a week. The advertisements promised 10 or 15. The language was careful. Domestic work, hotel service, hospitality, employment. Words vague enough to be technically truthful and specific enough to attract women who were desperate. They traveled for weeks. By train where rail lines existed, by stagecoach where they did not, and sometimes by freight wagon over the final stretch of empty territory between the nearest town and the fort. Some traveled in groups, chaperoned by a man employed by the hog ranch owner who maintained the fiction of legitimate employment until the journey was complete. When they arrived and saw the low building in the desert, the cribs, the soldiers waiting in the bar, the women already inside with hollow eyes and bruised arms, the reality of their situation became clear in a way that no amount of prior suspicion could have prepared them for. By then, the owner had already calculated the cost of their transportation and added it to their debt. They owed him before they had spent a single night under his roof. Others came through trafficking networks, operating out of port cities where immigrant women arrived with no money, no English, and no understanding of the country they had entered. San Francisco's waterfront was a primary source. Women arriving from China, from Mexico, from rural communities in Europe were intercepted by brokers who spoke their language and offered assistance that came with conditions the women could not read in contracts written in English. Some were purchased outright from families in poverty, so extreme that selling a daughter was not cruelty but arithmetic. A family that could not feed 6 children could feed 5. The money the broker paid bought food for a season. The daughter disappeared into a supply chain that moved human beings westward along the same routes that moved cattle and timber and ore. Some were war widows. The Civil War had produced over 300,000 Union dead and an unknown but substantial number of Confederate dead. Each death left behind a household that had lost its primary earner. Widows with children and no income faced options that narrowed rapidly. Charity was limited. Government pensions were small and unreliable. Remarriage required a supply of eligible men that the war had drastically reduced. Some of these women answered the same advertisements that recruited single girls from factory towns. Some were approached directly by agents who identified vulnerable women, the way predators in any era identify vulnerability, by watching for the signs of desperation that people try and fail to hide. And some were young. Territorial court records from Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming in the 1870s and 80s reference women in hog ranch establishments who were 14, 15, 16 years old, not women, girls. Children by any legal or moral standard of the era, trapped in cribs in the desert, serving soldiers twice or three times their age, accumulating debts they could not understand and would never repay. The records note their ages without comment, the way a ledger notes a figure without editorial. They were inventory. Their youth was a feature, not a tragedy. It increased their value to the owner and the frequency with which soldiers requested them. It also meant they were less likely to resist, less likely to understand their legal options, and less likely to survive the physical toll the system extracted from their bodies year after year. Now you understand who was inside those cribs. Women lured by false promises. Women purchased from trafficking networks. Women fleeing poverty, so total that a job in the desert seemed like salvation. Girls too young to understand what had been done to them until it was already irreversible. All of them trapped by a debt system designed to make departure impossible through arithmetic alone. But debt was a paper chain. It relied on the woman accepting the logic of what she owed, continuing to work because she believed, or could be made to believe, that one day the numbers would reach zero and she could leave. Some women did not accept that logic. Some women looked at the desert outside the crib door and decided that whatever waited in that empty landscape was better than another night in a 6-by-8-foot room. Some women tried to run, and for them the hog ranch operators had built something that paper could not accomplish. They had built the box. The punishment box was not a standardized device. It varied from one establishment to the next in the same way the cribs varied, built from whatever materials were available with whatever dimensions the owner considered sufficient. But the surviving descriptions share enough common features to establish a clear pattern. The boxes were constructed from rough pine or scrap lumber. They were typically 4 feet long and approximately 3 feet wide and 3 feet high, just large enough for a human being to fit inside if she drew her knees to her chest and bent her neck forward. Not large enough to sit upright, not large enough to extend her legs, not large enough to shift position in any meaningful way once the lid was nailed or latched shut. The boxes were placed outside. This detail is critical. Not in a storage room, not in a cellar. Outside against the exterior wall of the building, in direct sunlight. In the Arizona and New Mexico territories during summer months, air temperatures routinely exceeded 105 degrees. The surface temperature of a wooden box sitting in direct desert sun climbed far higher. 120 degrees, 130, 140. Inside a sealed box with no ventilation, the temperature became something that the human body is not designed to survive for extended periods. Dehydration began within hours. Heat exhaustion followed. After a full day, the body's core temperature could rise high enough to cause organ damage. After 2 days, the damage became permanent. After 3, it became fatal. Women were locked inside for periods ranging from several hours to several days, depending on the severity of their offense. Trying to escape was the most harshly punished transgression. Refusing a client could earn 12 to 24 hours. Being caught speaking to a soldier about conditions inside the establishment, asking for help, passing a message, could earn just as long. Being caught attempting to flee, as the woman in our opening had been, earned the maximum. 2 days. 3 days. However long the owner decided was necessary to ensure she would never try again. The box accomplished 2 things simultaneously. It punished the woman inside it, and it terrorized every other woman in the establishment. The box sat in plain sight. The other women could see it from the back windows of their cribs. In the brutal silence of the desert, they could hear the sounds that came from inside. The scratching, the moaning, the long stretches of silence that were worse than the sounds because silence from inside a box in 140-degree heat meant one of two things: unconsciousness or death. Every woman who heard those sounds or endured that silence understood the message the box was delivering. This is what happens when you try to leave. This is what waits for you if you disobey. This is the cost of resistance. The box did not need to be used often to be effective. It only needed to be used once within earshot of every woman in the building. After that, the box could sit empty against the back wall and still do its work. Its presence alone was punishment. Its emptiness was a threat. And every woman who passed it on her way to the outhouse or the water pump understood exactly what it meant. The box was for disobedience, for the women who had already demonstrated that they might resist, that they might run, that they retained enough of their own will to attempt something the owner could not tolerate. But there was another punishment tool used in the hog ranches that was not reserved for defiance. It was applied preemptively, not after a woman tried to escape, but before she could even consider it: the chains. Iron rings were bolted into the walls of cribs, or directly into the frames of the iron beds. These were not improvised restraints fashioned in a moment of cruelty. They were permanent fixtures, installed during construction the same way hinges were installed on doors and nails were driven into roof beams. The building was designed from its first plank to accommodate the physical imprisonment of the people who would occupy it. When a hog ranch owner built a new crib, he built the chains into it, the way a rancher builds a fence into a corral. The architecture itself was a confession of intent. These rooms were not designed for people who could leave. They were designed for people who would be kept. The chains were attached to the woman's ankle or wrist by iron cuffs. The length of chain varied, but was typically long enough to allow movement within the crib, from the bed to the wash basin to the curtain or door, and not a single inch further. A woman could perform the functions the owner required of her. She could lie on the bed. She could wash herself between clients. She could eat whatever food was brought to her. She could not step into the hallway. She could not reach the back door. She could not touch the front wall of the building, where the bar noise reminded her every night that a world existed beyond her 6-by-8-foot enclosure. At one hog ranch in the Arizona Territory, a military supply rider reported finding a woman chained to her iron bed frame who had been restrained continuously for weeks. Not days, weeks. She had not left the crib in that time. She had not stood fully upright because the chain attached to her ankle was short enough that standing required hunching forward. She had served clients during the entire period of her restraint. Soldiers had entered her crib, conducted their business, and left while she was physically chained to the bed on which the transaction occurred. They had seen the chain. They had seen the iron cuff around her ankle. They had stepped over the links on their way out the door, and they had returned to the fort and said nothing. The chains served a function beyond preventing escape. They prevented self-harm. Hog ranch operators understood, with the pragmatic cruelty of people who view human beings as revenue-generating assets, that women subjected to the conditions inside the crib sometimes attempted to end their own lives. A woman who could move freely might find a way to cut herself with a broken dish. She might tear her clothing into strips and fashion a ligature. She might simply walk into the desert at night and keep walking until the heat or the cold or the emptiness finished what the crib had started. A chained woman could do none of these things. The chains kept her alive the same way a farmer keeps livestock alive. Not out of compassion, but out of economic calculation. A dead woman generated no revenue. A chained woman generated revenue indefinitely. Think about this for a moment. These establishments did not exist in distant foreign empires or ancient civilizations. They existed in American territory. They operated under the jurisdiction of the United States government. They sat within walking distance of military forts that flew the flag of a nation that had, less than 20 years earlier, fought the bloodiest war in its history, partly over the question of whether one human being could own another. And at those forts, soldiers walked past the flag every morning on their way to formations where officers read orders about honor and duty and the defense of American values. And then, those same soldiers walked a mile south at sundown and paid 25 cents to use a woman who was chained to a bed frame. What does that tell you about the distance between what a nation says it believes and what it is willing to tolerate when the people suffering are invisible enough? Let me know in the comments. Because what comes next is worse. The United States Army knew. This is not speculation. This is not inference drawn from circumstance. This is documented in the Army's own records, in letters written by officers, in reports filed by military surgeons, in correspondence between forces. Did not merely tolerate the hog ranch system. It participated in it through a policy of deliberate engagement disguised as medical regulation. At forts across the Western Territories, post surgeons were ordered to conduct periodic inspections of the women at nearby hog ranches. The purpose of these inspections was not to assess the women's welfare. It was not to document their living conditions or determine whether they were being held against their will. The purpose was to examine them for venereal disease so that soldiers who visited the establishments would be less likely to contract infections that would reduce the fort's operational readiness. The women were examined the way equipment was inspected, not as people who might need help, but as potential sources of contamination that might degrade military assets. These inspection records survive in military medical archives. They are clinical documents. They note the number of women examined, the diseases identified, the treatments administered. They occasionally note physical conditions observed during examination, bruises, injuries, signs of malnutrition. But these observations are recorded without comment or follow-up, in the same detached language a veterinarian might use when noting that a working animal showed signs of overuse. The records confirm that military physicians entered these establishments, saw the cribs, saw the conditions, saw the women, and filed paperwork that acknowledged everything without addressing anything. Some fort commanders attempted to intervene. The historical record is not entirely without examples of officers who recognized the hog ranches for what they were and tried to act. At Fort Griffin in Texas, a commanding officer ordered the nearest hog ranch closed and its operator removed from the vicinity. The order was countermanded by his superior. At Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory, an officer who attempted to restrict soldier access to nearby establishments was warned that the policy would increase desertion rates and was told to reconsider. The calculation was made explicitly in correspondence that survives in military archives. The suffering of the women inside was weighed against the discipline of the soldiers outside. The soldiers won every time. The logic was brutally simple, and it was applied consistently across the frontier. Soldiers stationed at isolated posts with no recreation, no leave, and no outlet for the frustrations of frontier service became dangerous. Desertion rates at forts without nearby establishments ran as high as 30% annually. Alcohol-related incidents, fights, insubordination, and violence against officers increased dramatically when soldiers had no access to the hog ranches. Commanders who shut down nearby establishments watched their discipline collapse and their operational capacity degrade within weeks. The Army needed the hog ranches the way it needed supply lines and ammunition stores. The women inside were a resource being consumed in service of military readiness, and the chain of command protected that resource with the same institutional reflex it applied to any other strategic asset. The most damning evidence comes from the cases where individual women managed to reach the fort and beg for help directly. These instances are rare in the record, but they exist. A woman who escaped a hog ranch near Fort Stockton in Texas made it to the post gate and pleaded with the sentry to let her speak to the commanding officer. She was returned to the establishment the following day. The official explanation recorded in the fort's daily log was that the matter was a civilian dispute outside military jurisdiction. A civilian dispute. A woman fleeing imprisonment used the word help, and the United States Army used the word civilian and sent her back to the chains. This was not a failure of the system. This was the system functioning exactly as designed. The Army had drawn a jurisdictional line in the desert sand, 1 mile from the fort gate, and declared that everything beyond that line was someone else's problem. The hog ranch operators had built their establishments precisely on that line, close enough to profit from the soldiers, far enough to shelter behind the fiction of civilian jurisdiction. And in the gap between military authority and territorial law, in that 1 mile of desert that belonged to no one's conscience, women lived and suffered and died without anyone being officially responsible for what happened to them. If the Army would not help them, and the law could not reach them, the only option left was the desert, and the desert was its own kind of punishment. To understand why escape from a hog ranch was nearly impossible, you need to understand the geography these women faced. The western military frontier was not the green rolling landscape of the eastern states. It was emptiness on a scale that the human mind struggles to process. The nearest civilian settlement to many of these forts was 50 miles away. Some were 80, some were over 100. Between the hog ranch and that distant town there was nothing. No roads in many cases. No water sources that a person unfamiliar with the terrain would know how to find. No shade, no shelter. No landmarks that would prevent a disoriented person from walking in circles until exhaustion finished them. In the Arizona and New Mexico territories during summer, a person without water could die within 24 hours. In the northern plains during winter, exposure could kill in a single night. A woman leaving a hog ranch, on foot in the dark, which was the only time an escape attempt was possible, faced a calculation that the owner understood perfectly. She had no map. She had no water. She had no food. She had no shoes in many cases, because some operators confiscated footwear specifically to make flight more difficult. She had no knowledge of the terrain beyond what she could see from the back door of the building. She did not know which direction led to safety. She did not know how far that safety was. She only knew that behind her was a certainty of continued suffering, and ahead of her was a probability of death in the open desert. Most women who attempted to run were recovered within hours. Not because the owner organized sophisticated search parties, but because the desert did his work for him. A barefoot woman in the dark, dehydrated, malnourished, weakened by months or years of confinement, could not cover enough ground to escape the range of a man on horseback who waited until dawn and then followed her tracks in the sand. The tracks always told the same story. Straight at first, determined, purposeful, then gradually curving as disorientation set in, then wandering, then stopping. The owner would find her wherever the tracks stopped and bring her back to the box. Even if a woman managed to reach a settlement, her ordeal was not over. It was simply transformed. The legal structure of the Western territories offered almost no protection to women in her situation. Hog ranch operators held debt contracts that territorial courts recognized as binding. A woman who fled an establishment where she owed money could be pursued as a debtor. Local law enforcement, which in many frontier towns consisted of a single sheriff with limited jurisdiction, generally sided with the property owner. The woman had no documentation proving she had been held against her will. She had no witnesses willing to testify on her behalf. She had the word of a penniless woman with no fixed address against the word of a business owner who paid taxes and employed locals and contributed to the territorial economy. The outcome was predictable every time. And even in the rare cases where law enforcement did not actively return a woman to the establishment, the social structure of frontier communities accomplished the same result through different means. A woman who had lived in a hog ranch carried a stigma that frontier society enforced with ruthless consistency. No respectable household would hire her as domestic help. No hotel would employ her. No church would welcome her openly. The assumption of what had been done to her, the contamination that frontier morality attached to women in her situation, regardless of whether they had chosen it, closed every door that might have led to a different life. Some women who escaped one hog ranch ended up in another simply because no other economic option existed. They had fled captivity only to discover that the entire frontier was a larger version of the same trap, a landscape where a woman without money, without family, without reputation, had exactly one value and exactly one way to survive. Those who found no hog ranch to take them in and no town willing to accept them had one remaining option, the desert itself. Some women walked away from settlements that rejected them and were never seen again. No record of their death, no grave, no name in any document, just an absence where a person had been, a gap in the record that no one thought important enough to investigate or explain. The women who did not run, who stayed in the cribs because the desert offered no real alternative, faced a different kind of destruction. Slower than the box, quieter than the chains, but just as final. Disease moved through the hog ranches the way fire moves through dry timber. Venereal infections were endemic. Military surgeon reports from forts across the frontier document infection rates among soldiers that confirm what conditions inside the establishments must have been. If a significant percentage of soldiers visiting a hog ranch contracted disease, the women serving dozens of clients per week were exposed to infection at rates that made illness not a possibility but a certainty. Treatment was primitive when it existed at all. Mercury compounds that caused as much damage as the diseases they were meant to cure. Alcohol applied to open sores. Nothing in many cases. The military surgeons who inspected the women periodically treated infections only to the degree necessary to keep the women functional. Functional meaning capable of continuing to generate revenue. A woman too sick to work was not treated for her own benefit. She was treated so she could return to her crib. Tuberculosis was the silent killer. In cramped, unventilated rooms shared by multiple women in close quarters, the disease spread with devastating efficiency. The coughing started small and became constant. Blood appeared, weight dropped, breathing became labored and then agonizing. A woman with tuberculosis in a hog ranch crib continued working until she physically could not. There was no sick leave. There was no recovery period. There was the crib, and there was the box, and there was nothing in between. Alcohol and laudanum completed what disease began. Hog ranch operators provided both substances freely and in some documented cases forcibly. The logic was straightforward. A woman numbed by whiskey or opium was easier to manage. She resisted less. She complained less. She required less physical coercion because the chemical coercion did the work instead. Over weeks and months, dependence became addiction. Addiction became another chain, invisible but as effective as iron at preventing escape. A woman who could not function without the laudanum the owner provided could not walk into the desert, even if the door stood open. Her body would not allow it. The withdrawal symptoms, the shaking, the nausea, the pain that felt like every nerve in the body being stripped raw, began within hours of the last dose. The owner controlled the supply. The supply controlled the woman. No box required, no chains necessary, just a small brown bottle and the knowledge that the next dose was contingent on compliance. The combination of untreated disease, constant physical toll, malnutrition from inadequate food, and chemical dependence created a lifespan inside the hog ranch system that was measured in years rather than decades. Exact mortality figures do not exist because the women who died in these establishments were not considered important enough to count accurately. But the evidence that survives is consistent. Women arrived in their late teens or early 20s. Women who remained in the system rarely lived past their early 30s. A woman who entered a hog ranch at 18 might be dead by 28 or 30. 10 or 12 years. That was the working life of a human being inside this machinery. A decade of service in a 6 by 8 foot room, and then she was used up. What happened to women who could no longer work, varied by establishment and by owner, but the patterns were consistent enough to constitute policy. Some were sold to other hog ranches further from the forts, where standards were lower and prices were cheaper. A woman too sick or too damaged for a busy establishment near Fort Huachuca might still have value at a smaller operation near a lesser post, where soldiers were desperate enough to accept what better supplied forts rejected. Each sale was a step down. Each transfer meant worse conditions, less food, less medical attention, more violence, closer to the end. Women who could not be sold were simply removed, taken from the establishment and left at the outskirts of the nearest settlement, like damaged goods, returned to the roadside. Some were found by townspeople and taken in by charitable organizations that were just beginning to form in the larger frontier towns. Most were not. And at the worst establishments, the ones furthest from any oversight, women who died or who became too ill to move were buried on the property. Shallow graves in hard soil, unmarked, unrecorded, unknown to anyone except the owner who dug them, and the women still inside the building who understood that the ground behind the hog ranch held a truth that no one would ever come looking for. Consider the mathematics of disappearance. Dozens of hog ranches operating simultaneously across the Western Territories, each establishment holding between 5 and 20 women at any given time. Women cycling through the system with a working lifespan of roughly 10 years. The system operating at scale for nearly 4 decades, from the end of the Civil War to the closing of the frontier in the 1890s. The total number of women who passed through these establishments is impossible to calculate with precision because the people running them had every incentive to avoid creating records, and the people who might have investigated had every incentive to look the other way. But even conservative estimates suggest thousands. Thousands of women who entered low wooden buildings in the desert and never came out the same. Many never came out at all. And for decades, nobody with the power to stop it tried. Not because the information was unavailable, but because the women were invisible in every way that mattered. They had no political representation. They had no legal standing. They had no families nearby who might raise an alarm. They had no names that appeared in any document a civilian would ever read. They existed in the space between military jurisdiction and territorial law, in the gap that both authorities had agreed, through silence rather than statute, belonged to no one. What would you have done if you had been stationed at one of those forts? If you had walked past the hog ranch every week and heard the sounds from inside, and seen the box against the back wall baking in the sun? If you had known what was happening a mile from where you slept, and understood that saying something meant risking your career, and saying nothing meant accepting it, where do you draw that line? Drop your answer in the comments, because the people who eventually did speak up paid a price for it, and there were painfully few of them. The first sustained pressure against the hog ranch system came not from the military and not from territorial governments, but from reform organizations in the East, women's groups, religious organizations, and investigative journalists who had already been campaigning against similar systems in factory towns and urban districts, turned their attention westward in the late 1880s as the frontier became more connected to the rest of the country through railroads and telegraph lines. The isolation that had protected the hog ranches for decades was shrinking. In 1886, a reporter working for a reform publication in Chicago traveled to several military forts in the Kansas and Oklahoma territories and published accounts of what he found at nearby establishments. His descriptions were careful, constrained by the publishing standards of the era that forbade explicit language, visibly malnourished, bearing marks of physical punishment, unable to leave. He described the debt system. He described the box at one establishment, sitting empty against the back wall in the afternoon sun, and noted that the women he spoke to looked at it the way a beaten dog looks at the hand that strikes it. The articles generated outrage in eastern cities where readers had no framework for understanding conditions on the frontier. Petitions were sent to the War Department, demanding investigation. Women's organizations pressured territorial legislators. Church groups wrote to fort commanders directly, asking pointed questions that required carefully worded non-answers. The pressure was slow, inconsistent, and easily deflected by officials who could point to the jurisdictional gap as proof that the matter was someone else's responsibility. But it accumulated. Each article, each petition, each uncomfortable question made it slightly harder for the Army to maintain the fiction of ignorance. The Army responded, the way institutions respond when forced to acknowledge something they have profited from ignoring, slowly, partially, with reforms designed to manage the appearance of the problem rather than the substance of it. In the late 1880s, orders were issued at several forts requiring that hog ranches be established at greater distances from military posts. The logic was revealing. The problem, as the Army defined it, was not that the establishments existed. It was that they existed too visibly. Moving them further from the forts reduced the appearance of military complicity without changing the underlying reality. Soldiers walked further. The women suffered at a greater distance. Nothing else changed. Additional orders followed through the 1890s. Some forts banned soldiers from visiting nearby establishments entirely. These bans were enforced unevenly and often abandoned within months when the predictable consequences, desertion, alcoholism, violence, made the cost of enforcement higher than the cost of tolerance. At a few of the most notorious sites, direct closure orders were issued, backed by the threat of military force against operators who refused to leave. These closures made the reform organizations feel victorious. They rarely mentioned that the operators simply relocated to sites further from oversight and continued operating with the same women, the same cribs, the same chains, the same box. The system did not end through a single dramatic intervention. There was no law passed, no order given, no moment where the machinery stopped and the women walked free. The hog ranches disappeared the way the frontier itself disappeared, gradually, unevenly, driven not by moral awakening but by economic and demographic change. The Indian Wars wound down. Forts were decommissioned. The soldiers who had been the hog ranch's only customers were reassigned to posts near established towns where civilian law enforcement and public scrutiny made the old model unsustainable. The railroads brought settlers, and settlers brought churches and schools and newspapers, and the kind of community oversight that made it difficult to operate a building full of chained women a mile outside town without someone asking questions that could not be answered. With jurisdictional deflection. By 1900, the hog ranch system had largely ceased to exist in its original form. The buildings rotted in the desert. The lumber warped and split. The iron bed frames rusted. The chains corroded. The boxes collapsed into piles of weathered pine that blew apart in windstorms and scattered across the scrub brush until nothing remained visible to mark where they had stood. The desert reclaimed the sites with the same indifference it had shown to everything else that human beings had built and abandoned on its surface. But the women did not disappear as cleanly as the buildings. Some transferred to similar operations in mining towns and railroad camps, where the same economic model persisted under different names. Some ended up in the urban districts of growing western cities like Denver, San Francisco, and El Paso, where reform organizations documented their arrival with the same clinical detachment the military surgeons had used. They noted the women's ages, their physical condition, their addictions, their injuries. They rarely noted their names because most of the women no longer used the names they had been born with. Some had not spoken their real names in years. Some had forgotten them. A rare few left testimony. Fragments preserved in court records from territorial proceedings where hog ranch operators were occasionally charged with assault or debt fraud. brief statements in case files compiled by reform organizations that interviewed women willing to describe what had happened to them, letters written to family members back east that survived in personal archives. These fragments are almost all that remains. A sentence here, a paragraph there. A woman's voice preserved in someone else's handwriting in a document filed in a courthouse basement and forgotten for a century. One such fragment, preserved in the records of a women's aid society in Tucson, contains a single statement from a woman identified only by her initials. She had spent 4 years at a hog ranch near a fort in the southern Arizona territory. When asked to describe her experience, she said 7 words that the interviewer recorded verbatim and that survive in the file to this day. I was not a person in there. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the wooden box behind the building, to Sergeant Thomas Eddings prying a plank loose in the Arizona heat and finding a woman curled on her side in her own waist, half conscious, her body shutting down after 2 days, sealed inside an oven made of pine. Eddings pulled her out. He gave her water from his canteen. He carried her into the shade along the side of the building and waited while she drank in small sips because her throat was too swollen to swallow properly. What happened next is recorded only in a brief mention in military correspondence that survived because it was filed as part of an unrelated supply dispute. Eddings reported what he had found to his commanding officer. The commanding officer noted the report. No action was taken against the hog ranch operator. No investigation was opened. No charges were filed. The woman was not removed from the establishment. The box was not destroyed. The report entered the military filing system and sat there for over a century, a single paragraph in a folder full of requisition forms and inventory lists. A woman's suffering reduced to an administrative footnote sandwiched between entries about flour shipments and saddle repairs. We do not know her name. We do not know how old she was. We do not know how she came to be at that hog ranch, whether she answered an advertisement in a city newspaper or was sold by a trafficking network, or walked in out of desperation with nowhere else to go. We do not know how long she remained there after Eddings found her. We do not know whether she eventually escaped, was sold to another establishment, or died in that crib in the desert. We know only that she existed, that she suffered, that she was punished for trying to leave a place she had never chosen to enter, and that every institution that might have helped her chose not to. She was one of thousands. Thousands of women whose names were never recorded in any document that anyone thought worth preserving. Thousands of women who lived and worked and suffered and died inside low wooden buildings that no longer exist, at sites that have been reclaimed by desert scrub and prairie grass, near forts that are now ruins or historical markers where tourists stop to read plaques about cavalry campaigns and frontier bravery. The plaques do not mention the hog ranches. The historical markers do not note what stood a mile south of the fort gate. The interpretive signs describe military strategy and westward expansion and the courage of soldiers who tamed a continent. They do not describe the box. They do not describe the chains. They do not describe the women. Frontier archaeologists working near former military posts have identified sites consistent with hog ranch locations. At some of these sites, ground surveys have detected anomalies consistent with unmarked human burials. Depressions in the soil where the ground settled after something beneath it decomposed. Concentrations of iron fragments from bed frames and chain links corroding in the earth. These sites have not been systematically excavated. The funding is not there. The public interest is not there. The women buried in that ground, if that is what lies beneath it, remain where they were left over a century ago, uncounted, unnamed, waiting for someone to care enough to look. The American frontier was not an adventure. It was not a story of brave men taming a wild landscape and building a nation from nothing. It was also this, a system of small wooden buildings in the desert where women were bought and sold and punished and used and discarded within walking distance of the American flag. A system that operated for decades with the full knowledge of the United States military. A system that ended not because anyone decided it was wrong, but because the economic conditions that sustained it changed, and the buildings simply rotted away. The desert does not remember. The wind has scattered the lumber. The sand has filled the graves. The heat that baked those boxes has baked 1,000,000 days since, and will bake 1,000,000 more without distinction. But now, you remember, and that matters, because the only thing worse than what was done to those women is the possibility that it could be forgotten entirely, that their suffering could vanish into the same silence that surrounded them while they were alive. If what you have learned today matters to you, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss the stories that history tried to erase. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know what the Old West was really like, because the truth is darker and closer and more American than anything they have ever been taught. Drop a comment telling me which part of this story affected you most, and tell me where you are watching from, because these women deserve to be remembered in every corner of the world. But the American frontier was not the only place where women were imprisoned and punished inside systems that operated in plain sight. There is another chapter of hidden history, from another continent, another century, where the methods were different, but the silence was the same. That story is waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen and discover what was buried next.